I never imagined I would be the woman standing in her own kitchen at 39 weeks pregnant, watching my husband zip up his duffel bag for a long weekend away, while our 3-year-old clung to my leg and begged him not to go. I had spent years convincing myself that Daniel was just the kind of man who needed more space than most, that his restlessness was not a character flaw but simply who he was. I told myself I could live with that. What I did not know, standing there in our kitchen with the November light coming in cold through the window and our daughter wrapped around my ankle, was that I was about to learn exactly how wrong I had been. He called it a last hurrah. His college roommate Ryan was getting married in the spring, and Ryan had decided that a long Thanksgiving weekend in Nashville was the appropriate way to celebrate his final months of freedom. 4 days. 4 days during which I would be 39 weeks pregnant, caring for a 3-year-old named Mia, in a house 40 minutes from my nearest family member, unable to drive myself anywhere if something went wrong because my obstetrician had advised against long drives in the final weeks. I had explained all of this to my husband. I had laid it out clearly, calmly, the way I had learned to do things with Daniel because any hint of emotion from me was immediately labeled as drama. He told me first babies take forever and our second would be no different. Mia had taken 14 hours. He said this as though 14 hours of labor was a leisurely afternoon activity I could schedule around his plans. There were signs, of course. There are always signs. I see them clearly now, the way you see the shape of furniture in a dark room only after your eyes have had time to adjust. The way he had missed my first ultrasound because of a work happy hour he had already committed to. The way he went golfing the weekend after I was diagnosed with gestational hypertension because the doctor had said it was mild and he had already paid the greens fee. The way he consistently introduced me at his work events as his wife Sarah, as though my name were simply a clarifying detail attached to my function. I had adjusted to all of it so gradually that I had stopped noticing the adjustment. That is the thing about water rising slowly. You do not realize you are standing in it until it is past your waist. He hugged Mia, kissed me on the cheek, and told me to call him if anything actually happened. The way he said actually told me everything I needed to know about how seriously he was taking the possibility of my going into labor. He loaded his bag into the car. The door closed. Mia pressed her face against the front window and watched his taillights disappear, and I stood behind her with one hand on her shoulder and the other resting on the hard curve of my belly, feeling our baby shift position like she was settling in for something. I got through that first evening the way I had gotten through most hard things in my marriage, which was by keeping busy. I made Mia dinner, gave her a bath, read her 2 extra books because she asked and because I needed her warmth beside me as much as she needed mine. After she was asleep, I sat in the glider we had set up in the nursery, and I let myself feel the quiet of the house. It was not peaceful quiet. It was the particular quiet of a place where someone should be and is not. My sister Claire called around 9. She was 12 years older than me, and had always been direct in the way that only older sisters are permitted to be. She asked me how I was doing, and I said fine, and she was silent for exactly 3 seconds before she said, "Sarah, I need you to tell me what is actually going on." So I told her. I had not meant to, but once I started, I could not seem to stop, and by the end of it, I was crying in a way I had not cried in years. The kind of crying that comes from somewhere deep and pressurized, from somewhere that has been sealed shut for a long time. She said she was coming over. I told her not to, that it was a 2-hour drive and it was already after 9. She told me to go get my hospital bag ready and stop arguing with her. I did not go into labor that night. What happened instead was that Claire arrived just before midnight with overnight things and a bag of groceries, and we sat at my kitchen table and talked for 3 hours while I drank chamomile tea and she drank the coffee she always needed after a long drive. We talked about Daniel in a way I had never allowed myself to before, out loud, with someone else listening. I talked about the ultrasound he had missed, about the gestational hypertension diagnosis, about the way he had laughed when I suggested we tour the hospital because, he said, it was just a building and we already knew where it was. I talked about the way he managed our money, which meant the way he spent it on things that mattered to him, and reminded me that my part-time nursing hours made my financial contributions, as he phrased it, more supplementary than primary. I talked about the way I had slowly stopped telling him things because his responses had trained me out of it. The eye rolls, the sighs, the patient explanations of why I was overreacting, Claire listened to all of it, and then she said, very quietly, that she wished I had told her sooner. Not because she could have fixed anything, she said, just because I should not have been carrying all of that alone. We decided she would stay through the weekend. Daniel, when I texted him the next morning to let him know, responded 6 hours later with a thumbs up emoji. I stared at it for a long time. The contractions started on Saturday morning at 7:45. I know the exact time because I was watching Mia eat her oatmeal, and I felt the first one like a fist closing slowly around my lower back. I had felt Braxton Hicks for weeks, so I did not say anything. I finished making Mia's breakfast. I started timing. By 9 o'clock, they were 11 minutes apart and regular enough that Claire looked up from her phone and asked me if I was making a face. I called my obstetrician's answering service. The on-call doctor, a calm man named Dr. Okafor, whose voice I had never heard before, listened to my contraction timing and asked me several questions and told me to head to the hospital when they reached 5 minutes apart or if anything changed before then. He reminded me that second labors often progress faster than first. That detail landed somewhere in my chest with considerable weight, because Daniel had told me, with full confidence, that second labors were also slower because the body was less efficient the second time around. My husband had said this as though he had the faintest idea what he was talking about. I tried calling Daniel at 9:15. It went to voicemail. I tried again at 9:30. Voicemail. I sent a text that said I was having regular contractions and was timing them and he should have his phone on him. I watched the message deliver. I watched it sit there, unread, for 45 minutes. Claire helped me pack Mia's overnight bag for my parents, who lived 40 minutes away and had already been designated as our childcare backup for exactly this situation. Mia did not fully understand what was happening, but she was an observant child and she could read the energy in her room. She got very solemn and kept patting my hand and offering me her stuffed rabbit, whose name was Buttons, as a gesture of comfort. I told her Buttons should stay with her, and she considered this carefully and then agreed. My contractions were 7 minutes apart when my parents arrived to take Mia. My mother pulled me into a hug that lasted longer than a hug usually lasts, the kind where the person hugging you is communicating something they cannot say out loud. My father kept his hand on my shoulder while we talked and looked at me the way fathers look at their children when they are trying not to show how worried they are. He asked me twice if I had reached Daniel. I said I was sure he would call back soon. My father's jaw tightened slightly, and he nodded once and did not say what he was thinking. By the time Claire and I arrived at the hospital, my contractions were 4.5 minutes apart. A labor and delivery nurse named Patrice got me into a room and checked me and told me I was already 6 centimeters dilated. She said it with the matter-of-fact cheerfulness of someone who had delivered this information thousands of times. But I heard something warm in it too, a kind of quiet respect for what my body had already done on its own. 6 centimeters. I had labored through the drive to the hospital, and the intake paperwork, and the walk to my room at 6 centimeters without fully realizing it. My phone showed one missed call from Daniel at 11:20. He had called while I was being admitted. When I called back, it rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I left a message. My voice was steadier than I expected. What followed was 5 more hours of labor, during which Claire did not leave my side for a single minute except to refill my water. She held my hand through contractions, reminded me to breathe, told me I was doing exactly what I needed to do. She counted with me. When I lost my focus, she brought me back with the particular firmness that is only possible between people who have known each other their entire lives. I had a wonderful nurse and a skilled doctor and my sister's hand in mine, and somewhere across that equation, Daniel's absence should have registered as unbearable, but instead, I found myself moving away from it, with every hour that passed, not because it stopped mattering, but because other things were mattering more. My daughter was born at 4:17 in the afternoon. She was 7 pounds and 3 ounces, with a full head of dark hair and a furious, indignant cry that she directed at the ceiling with considerable conviction. The doctor placed her on my chest and she quieted almost immediately, which I took as a personality statement. I named her June, after my grandmother. Claire was crying before I was. She took approximately 400 photographs in the first 10 minutes. My phone showed 3 more missed calls from Daniel and 2 texts. The text said he had seen my messages and was trying to get a flight out, but everything was booked because of the holiday weekend and he would figure something out. The third text, sent at 4:49, 32 minutes after June was born, said he had found a flight for Sunday evening and would be home Monday morning. I put the phone face down on the bedside table and looked at my daughter, who had fallen asleep on my chest with the absolute certainty of someone who knew exactly where she was supposed to be. I thought about what my husband finding out he had a daughter through a text message that I had not yet sent said about the state of our marriage. I thought about what Monday morning meant, which was that he had decided a flight on Sunday evening was acceptable when his second child had just been born without him. I thought about a lot of things in those quiet minutes while June slept on my chest and the November light went dim outside the hospital window. My parents arrived with Mia at 6 o'clock. My mother held June and could not stop saying her name. June, June. Like she was testing the sound of it and finding it perfect. Mia climbed carefully onto the bed beside me and touched June's hand with one careful finger and then looked up at me with enormous eyes and said, "She's very small." I said, "She is." Mia said she thought buttons might be too big for her, and I said probably, but that June would grow into buttons eventually. Mia accepted this with the seriousness of someone making a long-term financial commitment. My father asked again about Daniel. I told him Daniel would be home Monday. Something moved across my father's face and settled. He did not say anything. Daniel arrived at the hospital Monday afternoon, 30 minutes before my discharge. He walked in still carrying his weekend bag. His face flushed and slightly sheepish in the way it got when he knew he had done something wrong but was already preparing the defense. He stopped when he saw June in the bassinet. "She was born Saturday," I said, 4:17 in the afternoon. He looked at me. He looked at June. He reached for the bassinet. I said, "I need you to not do that yet." He stopped. I said, "I need you to sit down and I need you to listen." What followed was not a screaming match. I had spent the last 48 hours being very clear with myself about what I wanted to say and how I wanted to say it. I spoke quietly, the way I had learned to speak in difficult conversations, not because I was trying to protect his feelings, but because I needed to be heard clearly. I told him what the 48 hours had looked like. I told him about the contractions starting while Mia ate oatmeal. I told him about calling and getting his voicemail and the thumbs-up emoji that morning and the way my father's jaw had moved when I said I was sure Daniel would call back. I told him about 6 centimeters and Claire counting with me and June being born with my sister's hand in mine instead of his. He said he had not known it would happen this fast. He said second babies were supposed to be slower. He started to say something about the flight situation. I said, "Daniel, I know you didn't know. That is not why I am telling you this. I am telling you this because I need you to understand that whether or not I went into labor on that specific weekend, you left. You left at 39 weeks. You made a calculation that your friend's bachelor party was more important than being available for your wife and your toddler. And a baby cannot be negotiated with, and that is not a surprise you discovered this weekend. That is something we both knew before you booked the flight." He said he was sorry. He said it the way people say they are sorry when they mean it, but are also hoping the apology will close the door on the conversation. I said, "I know you are. But I have been here for 3 years adjusting to how you move through this marriage, and I think I have finally run out of adjustment." He looked at me then in a different way. He said, "What does that mean?" I had not planned to have this conversation in the hospital room. I had planned to go home, get settled, get through the newborn fog for a few days, and then have it with more time and more space. But sitting there in that room with June in her bassinet and the evidence of the weekend laid out between us, I realized there was no better time. Waiting had gotten me here. I was done waiting. I told him that when we got home I would be moving into the guest room with June for the time being. I told him I had already called a family attorney, a woman named Patricia Garza who Claire had recommended, and that I had an appointment the following week. I told him that I was not asking him to leave the house right now because we had 2 children to figure out and I did not want to do this chaotically. But I was telling him clearly so he understood that what I was talking about was not a rough patch or a cooling off period. I was telling him where we were. He went very still. He sat down. He said, "Sarah, you can't be serious. We just had a baby." I said, "You weren't here when we had the baby." He did not have an answer for that. The first few weeks at home were the hardest, and also, strangely, some of the clearest of my life. Claire stayed for the first week. My mother came for the second. During the days, Daniel and I moved around each other with a kind of careful courtesy that was almost easier than the way we had been living before, when everything had been technically fine and quietly wrong. He held June when I needed to sleep. He took Mia to preschool in the mornings. He was present in the house in a way I had not seen in years, though I understood that crisis has a way of creating presence that ordinary life cannot seem to sustain. I met with Patricia Garza when June was 11 days old, sitting in her office with June in a carrier on my chest, while Mia was at preschool and my mother waited in the car with the heat running. Patricia was a small, precise woman who had the quality of making every question feel like it had already been answered somewhere, and she was simply helping you locate it. She walked me through what a separation agreement would look like, what temporary custody arrangements were standard for a nursing newborn, what my rights were with respect to the house and our finances. She was not warm exactly, but she was steady, and steady was what I needed. Daniel received the separation papers on a Thursday. He called me from the living room while I was in the guest room feeding June, which I thought said something about where we were. He asked me if we could talk. I said yes. We sat at the kitchen table after Mia was in bed, the way we had sat at that table 1,000 times before, and we talked for 2 hours. He cried. I had not seen Daniel cry in 7 years of marriage. It did not change what I knew, but it changed something in me, moved something loose, some small piece of grief for the version of us that had existed at the very beginning, before I had learned to make myself smaller to fit the space he allowed. I told him that I hoped we could do this without destroying each other. I told him that Mia and June needed 2 parents who could be in the same room without the air going wrong. He said he understood. He said he wanted to do right by the girls. I believed him, not because his track record suggested I should, but because grief has a way of making people mean the things they say, at least in the moment they are saying them. He moved into his brother's spare room in early December. I took Mia to see him there twice a week. June was too young to be away from me for extended stretches, which he accepted, though I could see it cost him something to accept it. We used a co-parenting app Patricia had recommended. All scheduling went through the app. All communication about the girls went through the app. It removed a layer of friction that I had not realized was there until it was gone. I went back to work part-time in February, when June was 3 months old. I had negotiated a schedule that overlapped with Mia's preschool hours and that Daniel could accommodate with his custody time. My manager, a woman named Diane who had been at the hospital for 20 years and had seen everything, accommodated my schedule without making me feel like she was doing me a favor. I want you to grow here, she told me during our meeting. You're one of the good ones. I had not thought of myself as good at my job in a long time. Daniel had a way of making my career feel like a hobby, something I did because I enjoyed it, not something that contributed in any meaningful way to our lives. Hearing Diane say it brought something back that I had not noticed going missing. By March, Daniel had enrolled in a parenting class through a local family services organization. He told me about it through the app, in a message that was factual and not performative, which I appreciated. He was attending every other week and had apparently become friendly with the instructor, a divorced father of 3 who had, by Daniel's account, some genuinely useful things to say. I read the message and thought about the man I had watched zip up his duffel bag in November and tried to locate him in the man who was now voluntarily attending a parenting class on Tuesday evenings. They were the same person. That was the complicated part. There was one evening in April when both girls were with Daniel for the afternoon and I sat in my kitchen alone. The first time I had been alone in the house in months, and I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the table where Daniel and I had signed the lease on this house 6 years earlier, when we had been people who still expected everything from each other. I sat there for a long time without doing anything. The house was very quiet. Outside the kitchen window, the yard was beginning to go green again, the slow, insistent green of spring that arrives whether you are ready for it or not. I was not at the end of something. I understood that clearly. I was in the dense, ongoing middle of it, the part where nothing has resolved and everything is still being worked out. But sitting at that table in the quiet, I felt, for the first time in a long time, like the quiet was mine. Not the quiet of someone who had been left out of decisions, not the quiet of someone waiting to see what the other person wanted before deciding what she thought. Just quiet. Mine. Daniel showed up with the girls at 5:30. Mia came through the door like a weather event, shoes immediately abandoned in the entryway, coat on the floor, voice at full volume about something that had happened at the park involving a dog and a puddle. June was awake in her carrier on Daniel's chest, looking around at the house with the alert curiosity she had developed recently that made everyone who met her say she had an old soul, whatever that meant. Daniel transferred June to me with the practiced ease that had developed over months of handoffs, the quick, efficient choreography of co-parenting, and then he stayed in the doorway while Mia told me the full story of the dog and the puddle, which required extensive narration and some physical demonstration. He looked tired. He also looked like someone who had spent an afternoon genuinely present with his children and had arrived home from it with the particular tiredness that comes from real engagement rather than exhaustion. He said, "She asked me today why you and I don't live in the same house." I looked at him. Mia had moved on to finding her abandoned shoes. He said, "I told her that sometimes moms and dads love their kids the same amount but figure out that it works better to live in different houses." She thought about it for a while and then asked if she could have a dog. I laughed. Actually laughed. Not the careful diplomatic laugh I had produced for years in service of keeping things smooth. He smiled. It was a real smile. A little sad, but real. He said, "I know I can't ask you for things anymore. I understand that. But I want you to know, I'm working on it. Not for you. For them." I said, "I know. I see it." He nodded. He gathered the empty carrier and the diaper bag and said goodbye to the girls, and I stood in the doorway and watched him walk to his car the same way Mia had stood at the front window in November and watched his taillights disappear. The difference was that this time I was not afraid of what came next. June's first summer was a season of small revolutions. I took the girls to the farmer's market on Saturday mornings and let Mia choose one thing she had never tried before. I started sleeping in what had been our bedroom, with the windows open and no one's preferences to negotiate around. I started running again for the first time since before Mia was born. Short distances at first and then longer, early in the mornings before the girls were awake, in the particular silence of a neighborhood before the day has begun. I had forgotten how much I liked the feeling of moving through the world under my own power with no destination other than the one I chose. My parents had June's half-birthday dinner at their house, which was not a real occasion by any objective measure, but my mother said she had missed June's actual birthday because June had arrived while she was parking the car, and she intended to celebrate extensively to compensate. Daniel came, because we had agreed that for major events involving the girls we would both be there, and he sat at the table with my parents and my sister Claire and her husband, and did not try to be the center of anything. He helped clear dishes when dinner was over. My father watched him do it without expression and then, later, found me in the kitchen and said quietly that he thought Daniel was trying. I said I thought so too. My father said that was something. Not everything, but something. On the drive home, with both girls asleep in their car seats, I had the particular experience of feeling more than one thing at exactly the same time: grief and relief and a tentative, carefully tended sense of something that might eventually become pride. Pride not in surviving something, but in having decided, clearly and at considerable cost, that survival on bad terms was not the goal, that the goal was something better than that, something more than an empty house and a thumbs-up emoji and a husband calculating whether my labor was inconvenient for his schedule. Mia woke up when I pulled into our driveway. She asked if we were home and I said yes. She asked if tomorrow was a preschool day and I said no. It was Saturday. She thought about this and said good, because she wanted pancakes. I said we could do that. I carried June inside and settled her in her crib and went back out to get Mia, who had waited patiently in her car seat because she knew that was the rule. I unbuckled her and she climbed out with the reliable unpredictability of toddlers, and then she put her arms up and I lifted her, which I would not be able to do much longer because she was 3 and growing in that relentless way children grow when you are watching them closely. She put her face against my neck and said, "You smell like outside," I said. That's because we were outside. She considered this and seemed satisfied. We went inside. I locked the door. The house was quiet with the particular quality it had developed in recent months, the kind of quiet that belongs to us, that carries our routines and our voices and the specific weight of the life we are building together, the 3 of us. It was not a story I had planned. It was not the story I had thought I was going to live when I stood at an altar 8 years ago and said things I meant with my whole heart. But it was mine, and it was real, and it had been built not out of the best case I had imagined, but out of the choices I had made when the worst case arrived. I made chamomile tea. I sat down at the kitchen table. Tomorrow we would have pancakes. June would watch from her bouncer with those alert, considering eyes, and Mia would insist on pouring her own syrup, and I would let her, and it would make a mess, and that would be fine. That would be more than fine.